brief reign of the Egyptian boy king Pharaoh Tutankhamun was anomalous in many ways, and yet it was also profoundly representative of the very nature of agrarian civilizations. So let's consider the reign of King Tut as we begin our investigation of the extraordinary civilization of the ancient Egyptians. Tutankhamun's father was the controversial pharaoh Akhenaten, whose radical religious views led to political chaos in the Egyptian state, as we will see. Upon his father's death, King Tut ascended to the throne at the tender age of 9 and then ruled for about 10 years between 1332 and 1323 BCE. In the third year of his reign, probably on the advice of his powerful advisor Ai, Tutankhamun reversed the religious policy of his father. He restored the ancient and powerful god Amun to the position of supremacy that he had held before Akhenaten's reign. To reinforce this return to pre-Akhenaten religious orthodoxy, Pharaoh Tutankhamun began the construction of new temples dedicated to Amun at Thebes and Karnak. In foreign policy, the boy king's administration was also remarkably active. It restored diplomatic relations with the Mitanni, a powerful imperial state then in control of much of modern Syria, and this freed up the resources needed to wage military campaigns far to the south against the Nubians. These initiatives suggest a very promising reign for Pharaoh Tutankhamun, but the young ruler was also dealing with serious health problems, most of which stemmed from the fact that he was a product of inbreeding between his father and his father's sister. Thanks to the forensic work done by modern scientists on Tut's remains, both genetic and medical evidence describe Tutankhamun as 5'11" tall, as very skinny, with a cleft palate and scoliosis in his spine, and also with a partially clubbed foot so that he needed a cane to walk. This last condition is borne out by the fact that several walking sticks were discovered in his tomb, presumably to help this semi-disabled young ruler continue to walk in the afterlife. Such extraordinarily detailed information gleaned from the mummified remains of an Egyptian pharaoh who lived over 3,300 years ago is a fitting testament both to the quality of Egyptian Obamas and also to the sort of forensic skills that scientists are able to bring to bear on ancient victims in the 21st century. Forensic evidence suggests that the death of the young pharaoh at age 19 might have been caused by a fractured leg that became infected, but genetic evidence also hints that a severe bout of malaria probably played a role. With Pharaoh Tutankhamun's death in 1323 BCE, his royal lineage, that of the Thutmosid family, came to an end. Tutankhamun had done his best to continue his family's line, but the discovery of 2 stillborn fetuses in his tomb demonstrates that those attempts were tragically in vain. The pharaoh was buried in the Valley of the Kings across the Nile River from the city of Luxor. He was placed in a tomb that was small for his status, perhaps because his death occurred unexpectedly before completion of a more suitable, grander tomb. Chemical analysis of the paint on the walls of the tomb indicates that it may have still been wet when the tomb was sealed, also suggesting a hasty conclusion to his otherwise elaborate burial. After Tut's death, his advisor Ai seized the throne to be succeeded in turn by the usurper Horemheb. Horemheb was succeeded by Ramesses I, who had served as Horemheb's co-regent and who established Egypt's 19th dynasty. He was to become one of the most powerful pharaohs of all. Such then are the few details we have of the reign of the boy king Tutankhamun, seemingly one of the least significant reigns of all the great pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Indeed, his successors tried to erase all knowledge of Tut's reign and that of his ancestral line from the historical record. Yet, what we've learned from Tut's tomb makes him an extraordinarily important pharaoh for us and suggests that he was by no means unimportant in Egypt's history. Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered in 1922 by a British team led by Howard Carter and George Herbert, the Earl of Carnarvon. The discovery of the almost intact tomb stacked full of treasures and of the pharaoh's mummified body and stunning golden death mask was sensational news worldwide and helped spark a revival of interest in Egyptian civilization. Howard Carter later wrote, "The pharaoh who in life was one of the least esteemed of Egypt's pharaohs has become in death the most renowned." But I'd like to suggest that Howard Carter was wrong in his assessment of Tutankhamun's power in his day. In a reign of a decade or less, Pharaoh Tutankhamun had the power and prestige to undo the religious policies of his father and to return the great god Amun to his place at the top of the Egyptian pantheon, thereby restoring order to the fragmented state. Meanwhile, Tut's foreign policy decisions ensured that Egypt remained a genuine Afro-Eurasian power throughout a reign that coincided with the very apogee of Egyptian military dominance over a huge swathe of North Africa and the Middle East. So the boy king Tutankhamun, despite his numerous debilitating health problems and brief reign, is actually a quintessential example of the absolute semi-divine rulers who were presiding over vast states and civilizations all over Eurasia by the 14th century before the Common Era. These rulers, of course, owed their power and prestige to the administrative templates established by their regional predecessors, by Sargon of Akkad, by Hammurabi of Ur, and by the many great pharaohs of Egypt that had preceded Tutankhamun. And in every single region of Eurasia where leaders like this were flourishing during the 14th century before the Common Era, so in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Mediterranean, the Indus Valley, East Asia, these rulers and their elite class owed their wealth and success to farming. The reason why the Egyptian state was able to achieve such heights of military power and to create the sort of wealth so amply demonstrated by the lavish artifacts found in Tut's tomb is successful agriculture. And this in turn was dependent upon the exploitation of the particular environmental circumstances these states were located in. Put simply, if the environment had not favored successful agriculture, and if local farmers had not been able to exploit these conditions, the great civilizations of the ancient world would never have appeared or been able to sustain themselves. Just think of the cost to the state of the embalming of the young pharaoh's body, of his mummification and his elaborate burial in a tomb equipped with lavish weapons, ornaments, and food. These customs and the religious beliefs that underpin them are striking evidence of the sheer prosperity of the great agrarian civilization of Egypt, a fact acknowledged by lavish depictions of bountiful harvests that decorate the walls of the pharaoh's tombs. It is the success of these harvests, then, that explain the massive accumulation of wealth that is so grandly revealed in Tut's tomb. As was the case in Mesopotamia, it was river valley-based irrigation agriculture that explains the success, prosperity, and longevity of Egyptian civilization. At the heart of Egyptian civilization was the Nile, which created the valley that was and still is rich with alluvial soils and provided water for irrigation. The Egyptians called the Nile Valley Kemet, which means the Black Land, a reference to the annual floods that spread rich black soil along a 750-mile stretch of the valley between Egypt's border with Sudan and the Nile Delta. Millennia after the founding of the Egyptian state, the ancient Greek historian Herodotus had no doubts about the basis for Egyptian prosperity when he named Egypt the gift of the Nile. Fed by rain and snow in the high mountains of East Africa, the Nile is the world's longest river, flowing some 4,160 miles from Lake Victoria to its delta on the Mediterranean coast. It descends from the mountains in a series of cataracts or shallow rocky stretches that were next to impossible to navigate by boats. In the spring, melting snow and rain swell the river, which then surges north through the modern Sudan and Egypt. The predictable annual flooding of the Nile sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia and was only disrupted in modern times by the completion of the huge Aswan Dam in 1986. Life in Egypt wasn't always so dependent on the Nile, however. It was climate change that made it so. When the last ice age waned around 10,000 years ago, much of North Africa that is now covered by the Sahara Desert was then a region of fertile grasslands, rivers, and lakes. Human foraging communities flourished in the region during the late Paleolithic era, and in a process that we have observed already, many of these affluent foragers settled down and eventually made the transition to agriculture. The gradual warming of the earth continued, however, until by 5000 BCE, increasing temperatures and aridity in the region had turned grasslands into deserts and forced farmers to gather around bodies of water, including the narrow valley of the Nile. These farmers, herders, and cultivators who had moved with their domesticated grains and animals into the valley from the Sudan quickly realized that the key to successful agriculture in the Nile Valley was to make use of rich flood soils by diverting waters from the river for irrigation farming. And so a network of channels and canals was constructed to get the river water out into the fields. It is the success of these early farmers and of the canals they dug that led to the emergence of an increasingly wealthy series of states that morphed eventually into the great civilization of ancient Egypt. So once again, the story of agrarian civilizations is also the story of careful manipulation of the environment and of intelligent human responses to climate change. Archaeology shows us that by 5000 BCE, the beginning of the so-called pre-dynastic period, farmers had learned to plant their crops in the floodplain in late summer after the recession of the annual flood. The crops then matured during the cooler months of the year and were then harvested late in winter or early in the spring. The system worked so well that substantial agricultural resources were accumulated, leading to increased populations that gathered together in villages along the river valley, all of them practicing intensive irrigation agriculture. By 4000 BCE, there were many such villages along the Nile shores, stretching hundreds of miles. As had been the case in Mesopotamia, denser concentrations of people increased the need for formal organization. And in what is today Sudan, several small farming communities evolved into independent kingdoms. This led inevitably to competition between the kingdoms, and as a result, some became larger and more powerful, like Ta Seti, a Nubian kingdom that flourished between 34 and 3200 BCE, and which extended its rule down into the Nile Valley of Upper Egypt. Now, tradition, somewhat substantiated by historical evidence, suggests that unified rule came to Egypt later in the 4th millennium as a result of the efforts of a semi-legendary conqueror named either Menes or Nama. Menes is said to have started his career as an ambitious minor official in a southern Egyptian kingdom. By roughly 3100 BCE, he had succeeded in uniting all of Upper Egypt, that is the upper or southern Nile Valley, after which he began to incorporate all the villages of Lower Egypt, that is the Delta region, into an expansive state. To facilitate this, he founded the first city of Egyptian civilization, Memphis, near modern Cairo, strategically located at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt. Memphis became the political and cultural center of early Egypt, and Menes and his successors were eventually able to unite all of the territory between the Nile Delta and the First Cataract into a single powerful kingdom. During the next period in Egyptian history, known as the Old Kingdom and lasting between 2686 and 2180 BCE, rulers of the 3rd to 6th dynasties established order and stable administration throughout Egypt. One of the themes this course follows is the various experiments in governance that different societies and civilizations have tried. These powerful Old Kingdom rulers saw themselves as both divine and human, and they adopted the name Pharaoh from Per-Au, or Great House. To finance their administrations, the pharaohs took ownership of enormous royal estates and used these agricultural resources to support a bevy of advisors, priests, scribes, artisans, and merchants. The early pharaohs associated themselves with one god in particular, Horus, the sky god, and they often chose to be depicted in the image of a falcon or a hawk, the symbol of Horus. Later pharaohs saw themselves as offspring of the more powerful sun god Ammon, and the idea emerged that after his death, the pharaoh would merge with Ammon. The pharaohs were also depicted in monumental sculpture as enormous figures towering over their people, projecting the strength and awesome power needed to protect the Egyptians and their lands through their domestic and foreign policies. The early pharaohs had to deal with complex foreign relations, particularly the ongoing tense relationship with Nubia. The Egyptians were wary of the threat Nubian kingdoms and their powerful militaries could pose to Upper Egypt. But the Egyptians also wanted to get hold of the many valuable resources controlled by the Nubians, resources such as gold, ivory, and ebony. The Nubians, for their part, wanted to safeguard their independence and profit from trade. These tensions led to at least 5 military campaigns waged by Egyptian forces against Nubia between 3100 and 2600, until the Egyptian military eventually gained control of Lower Nubia. But the Nubian leaders simply moved further south and formed strong states in Upper Nubia, including the powerful kingdom of Kush. Despite these political tensions, diplomatic and trade relations between Nubia and Egypt remained strong, and eventually Nubian males made up a large part of the Egyptian army, often intermarrying with Egyptian women. It was the belief that the pharaohs were divine that led to the construction of the monumental pyramid tombs within which the king's embalmed body would be preserved forever. But to ensure his eternal preservation, the mummification of the pharaoh's body had to be meticulous, because keeping the physical body intact was seen as the passport to eternity. It was pharaohs of the 4th dynasty that constructed the enormous Giza Plateau pyramids near Cairo today. The largest of all Egyptian pyramids is that built to house the mummified body of Pharaoh Khufu, who was also known as Cheops. His pyramid involved the precise cutting of an estimated 2,300,000 limestone blocks, weighing an average of 2.5 tons each, to construct a building that in the end weighed 6.5 million tons. Now, by way of contrast, the Empire State Building weighs a mere 365,000 tons. Modern engineers estimate that the construction of the Pyramid of Khufu would have required 84,000 laborers who worked around 80 days per year for about 20 years. Recent evidence, including the discovery of the tombs of many of these workers nearby, suggests that the labor force was actually paid for their work rather than coerced. In addition, hundreds of architects, engineers, craftsmen, and artists would have also been required to complete the decorative details of this monumental tomb. Herodotus has left us with a detailed description of the process by which the pharaohs were mummified. The embalmers first used a metal hook. They inserted it to remove the brains through the nostrils, after which the body's internal organs were taken out through an incision. The body was washed and filled with spices and herbs, then covered for 2 months in a type of soda ash related to salt called natron. Natron was harvested naturally in ancient Egypt from dried lake beds, and not only was it superbly effective as a drying agent, it also helped destroy any bacteria that might be trying to establish themselves in the body. When the natron had done its work and extracted all the moisture from the body, it was cleaned and wrapped in strips of fine linen covered with resin. Adorned with jewelry, the body was finally placed in a coffin bearing a painted or sculpted likeness of the pharaoh. Think again of the extraordinary death mask of Tutankhamun. Towards the end of the 6th dynasty, Old Kingdom prosperity came to an end, partly because the enormous cost of building the pyramid tombs exhausted the state treasury, and also because the power of the kings was increasingly challenged by regional rulers who eventually succeeded in fragmenting the state. The environment also played a role here, because a 50-year-long severe drought after 2200 BCE disrupted the Nile floods, leading to famine and social unrest. During the so-called First Intermediate Period that followed the collapse of the Old Kingdom, civil war raged in Egypt, and power was divided amongst regional rulers. Stability was restored by the rulers of the 11th and 12th dynasties around 2030 BCE, which marks the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. During the reign of the 12th dynasty warrior king Senusret III, the Egyptian military was once again very active in Nubia, where a series of forts were built to try and retain control. But the 12th dynasty came to an end with the death of Queen Sobek Neferu. She left no heirs, and her reign was succeeded by the much weaker 13th dynasty. Late in the 13th dynasty, much of northern Egypt was conquered by a group of mysterious invaders known as the Hyksos. an Egyptian word that simply means rulers of foreign countries. This conquest marks the end of the Middle Kingdom and the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period. The identity of the Hyksos remains uncertain even today, but they appear to have been West Asian peoples that moved in from the east and had formed their own independent state in the Nile Delta by roughly 1720 BCE. Scholars are divided on whether to characterize their arrival as a violent invasion or a simple migration into an already deeply fragmented Egypt. Certainly, the Hyksos had a number of military advantages over the Egyptians, including the chariot, bronze weapons, battle axes, and composite bows. They may have borrowed the chariot from the Hittites, who used it so effectively in conquering Mesopotamia and in wars with the Egyptians as well. The Hyksos eventually formed their own 15th dynasty, but Upper Egyptian rulers of the 17th and 18th dynasties adopted Hyksos military technologies and waged a series of campaigns to drive the foreigners out. These evolving military technologies on both sides remind us of the critical role conflict between states has played in stimulating collective learning and technological innovation. Working from Thebes and later Memphis, Egyptian leaders gradually pushed the Hyksos out of the Nile Delta, and by the mid-16th century, Egyptians had regained their independence and founded a powerful new state, the New Kingdom, which would last from 1550 to 1150 BCE. During the New Kingdom, Egyptian experiments in managing a huge and wealthy state reached their zenith. Highly educated scribes kept detailed records that have survived the millennia to provide historians with a fascinating record of 4 centuries of Egyptian affairs. Both the records and the astonishing archaeological treasures discovered from this period demonstrate that the pharaohs of the New Kingdom presided over a tremendously wealthy and resplendent civilization that required increasingly sophisticated techniques of governance. Agricultural surpluses supported a population of perhaps 4 million people, with a large army and complex bureaucracy made up of various quite modern-sounding entities. These included a ministry to preside over court and royal estates, a military administrative hierarchy, a religious bureaucracy, and ministries of agriculture and local affairs. One government department was entirely concerned with the administration of conquered territories, a necessary addition because the New Kingdom was also the great era of Egyptian imperial expansion. The initial motivation behind this may have been a desire by the pharaohs to prevent further invasions by groups such as the Hyksos, by seizing control of regions that might pose a potential threat, an approach the Romans would also take more than 1,000 years later to similarly become somewhat reluctant empire builders. The best known imperialist was Pharaoh Thutmose III, who during a long reign of 56 years between 1481 and 1425 BCE, personally led Egyptian armies on 17 separate campaigns to Syria and to the Euphrates, making Palestine the nucleus of an expansive Egyptian empire. For half a millennium then, Egypt was an imperial power, and tribute flowed in from all over Western Eurasia and North Africa. The empire reached the peak of its wealth and power during the 4 decades-long reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III between 1386 and 1349 BCE. Like his dynastic predecessors, Amenhotep III was buried in the western valley of the kings because the pharaohs of the New Kingdom did not build pyramids for their tombs. What they did build were stupendous palaces and statues to demonstrate their power, and also magnificent temples dedicated to their preferred gods. Amenhotep III added significantly to the temple at Karnak, and also started work on an enormous temple complex at Thebes. But this complex was built on a floodplain, and within 2 centuries, all that remained were the enormous colossi of Memnon, 2 50-feet-high statues of the pharaoh himself. It was during the reign of Amenhotep IV, the son and successor of Amenhotep III and the father of Tutankhamun, that the Egyptian state was weakened by a power struggle between the king and the priests of the sun god Amun. Amenhotep IV caused chaos within the religious hierarchy of Egypt, particularly the powerful priesthood of Amun, by changing his name to Akhenaton to demonstrate his personal loyalty to an alternative sun god, a god named Aton, which means something like the light within the sun's disk. And what appears to have been the very first attempt in history to articulate a monotheistic ideology, Akhenaton then tried to replace Amon with Aton by establishing a new cult in Aton's honor. The new god was now depicted as the complete disk of the sun, shining high in heaven and sending its rays down upon the royal family. At some stage, probably in the 5th year of his reign, Akhenaton launched a program to try and erase all reference to Amon on temples and shrines, which led to the destruction of many temples, a move which surely evoked opposition from Amon's priests. Instead, Akhenaton built temples to Aton and promulgated paeans to the new deity. Archaeologists have discovered several texts praising Aton as the one true God. Now, the most famous of these texts is the one known as the Great Hymn to Aton. The first verse opens with these lines: "Splendid you rise in heaven's light land, O living Aton, creator of life. You are beauteous, great, radiant, high over every land. Your rays embrace the lands. Though you are far, your rays are on earth. Though one sees you, your strides are unseen." Akhenaton's conversion to the worship of Aton was followed by great religious conflict and civil unrest, and during that turbulent time, much of the Egyptian empire was lost. But as we have seen, Akhenaton's son Tutankhamun restored order to the state during his reign, and the priests of Amon took the opportunity to destroy the temples and public inscriptions dedicated to Aton. After King Tut's death, an ambitious army commander named Horemheb usurped the throne. Childless late in his reign, Horemheb appointed as crown prince an army friend, Ramesses, and Ramesses attempted to regain control of Syria and Palestine. His efforts led to conflict with the Hittites, who had invaded Mesopotamia and large regions of the eastern Mediterranean. The climax of these attempts to rebuild the Egyptian empire occurred during the reign of Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great. He did succeed in regaining control of Palestine, but was unable to drive the Hittites from Syria. In the end, the two sides signed a very modern peace treaty instead, which required both sides to undertake equal commitments to each other. There would be no further acts of aggression by either party. Prisoners would be repatriated, and each would come to the other's aid if threatened, and the treaty was binding on the signatories' children and grandchildren. Ramesses II's long reign was Egypt's last era of national grandeur. After his death, royal authority was lost to the priests of Amon in Thebes, who established their own dynasty to rule Upper Egypt in the third intermediate period from 1070 to 332 BCE. The once mighty Egyptian state fragmented. Merchant princes established their own dynasties in the Delta. Libyans invaded from the west and also established their own dynasty. And in 760, Egypt was conquered by its old foes and trading partners, the Nubians, specifically the rulers of the powerful Nubian Kush kingdom. King Kashta of Kush founded his own dynasty that ruled Egypt for a century before the Assyrians, who had seized control of Mesopotamia, invaded Egypt and drove out the Kushites. Egyptian prestige was briefly revived during the 26th dynasty between 663 and 525 BCE. The Assyrians were expelled, Egyptian culture was restored, the first Egyptian navy was created, and 12,000 laborers dug most of a canal from the Nile mouth to the Red Sea, the first Suez Canal. But Egypt, like much of Western and Central Eurasia, was conquered by the Persians in 525, then conquered again by Alexander of Macedon in 332. And for the next 2,000 years, Egypt was relegated to the status of a province in a series of powerful empires, beginning with the Romans. Egypt would not regain independence until the advent of Gamal Abdel Nasser in the mid-20th century. The great age of Egyptian civilization and of all-powerful semi-divine pharaohs like the boy king Tutankhamun was over.